Why keep the deed if you're just going to forget where it is? Yenvai's voice cut through the warm afternoon air like a blade wrapped in silk. She said it lightly, almost playfully, the way you'd tease an old woman who'd misplaced her glasses for the third time that week. But there was nothing playful in her eyes. There never was. We were sitting in the front room of the house my husband built with his own hands. The house where the ancestral altar still held his photograph between two brass candlesticks, where the smell of sandalwood incense never quite left the air no matter how many windows I opened. Kai sat across from me on the old rosewood divan, saying nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor tiles like they held some answer he was too cowardly to look up and find. There were guests in the room. 3 of them the village elder I'd known since I was a young bride, 2 neighbors who'd come to pay respects on the anniversary of my husband's passing. They all heard it. The silence afterward had weight, the kind that presses against your eardrums. I did not answer her. I reached for the teapot instead, the one with the small chip on its spout that my husband always said gave it character, and I poured. The stream of tea was steady, unhurried, the same pour I'd made 10,000 times in this house for my husband, when he came home dust-covered from the fields, for his mother in her final years, for visitors who needed nothing more than a warm cup, itaki. Takti and dedabra. I let the silence stretch. I let it become its own kind of answer, the kind that unsettles people far more than words ever could. Yenvi's smile faltered just slightly. At the corners she'd expected something. Tears. Maybe. An argument. A confused old woman fumbling to defend herself. What she got instead was a cup of tea pushed gently toward her side of the table, and a faint smile that did not reach all the way to my eyes. 40 years of measuring boundaries, reading old maps, under fluorescent office lights, listening to families argue over fence lines and rice paddies, and the precise width of an inherited path 40 years teaches a person something about patience. It teaches you that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one holding the truth. It teaches you that paper outlasts anger, that records outlive memory, and that a woman who has spent her life filing other people's land disputes does not forget, under any circumstance, where her own documents are kept. But none of them knew that yet. To them, I was simply Han widowed, white-haired, soft-spoken, the kind of mother-in-law you could speak over at the dinner table without consequence. Let them think it a little longer. There is a kind of power in being underestimated. I had learned that lesson decades before any of them were born. It was the 3rd month since Yenvai first asked to help me hold on to the land deed. The 3rd month since she'd smiled that same smile and said the documents would be safer with her, that an old woman shouldn't carry such important things around. That paper gets lost. That memory fades. I had let her take it. Not because I believed her concern was real. I had stopped believing in that particular performance somewhere around the 2nd visit, but because I wanted to see, clearly, and without doubt, exactly how far she and my son were willing to go. Now I knew. My gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, to the altar in the corner. The photograph of my husband looked back at me the way it always did. Steady, unchanged, a little amused, the way he used to look at me across the dinner table when I was about to say something he found both irritating and correct. 38 years of marriage teaches you to read a face even when it's frozen in a frame. I could almost hear him. You always did wait until the very end to speak, Han. Even now. He was right. He always had been about that. Still water runs the deepest. My mother used to tell me. Back when I was a girl in a village so small it didn't appear on any official map until I was the one who drew it onto one. She said it about rivers, about people, about grief. She never could have known how many times in my life I would return to those 5 words and find them true all over again. The wind moved through the open window then, carrying with it the scent of burning joss sticks from the altar, mixing with the green, mineral smell of the rain that had fallen that morning, and left the courtyard stones dark and glistening. Somewhere outside, a motorbike passed slowly along the dirt road, its engine fading into the distance, the way most things eventually do, except for the things you choose, very deliberately, not to let fade. Kai finally looked up. For one brief moment, something flickered across his face, not quite shame, not quite fear, something closer to the look of a boy who has thrown a stone through a window and is only now realizing the glass cannot be put back together. He opened his mouth, as if to say something. Nothing came out. His wife's hand found his knee under the table, a small, firm pressure, and he closed his mouth again. I watched him do it. I watched him choose silence over his own mother, the same way he had chosen, 3 months earlier, to stand quietly in the doorway, while his wife asked to help me with documents that had been in my keeping since before he was even born. The village elder cleared his throat, perhaps sensing the temperature of the room, and began speaking about something unrelated, the upcoming harvest. A leak in the communal well pump, anything to fill the space my silence had left behind. I let him talk. I sipped my tea. I smiled the way a woman smiles when she has already seen the ending of a story everyone else believes is still being written. They had no idea what I had done that morning, before any of them arrived. They had no idea where I had gone, what I had asked for, what was now sitting quiet, official, and absolutely undeniable in the bottom drawer of my husband's old writing desk, beneath his folded shirts, and the wristwatch he never finished repairing. Let Yenvi ask her question again, if she wished. Let her ask it 100 times. I would keep pouring tea, and I would keep waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be the only answer I needed to give. 43 years ago, I was the only woman working in the land registry office of our district, and I was not supposed to be there at all. My father had wanted me to marry early, the way most girls in our village did, and settle into a life measured by harvests and children, rather than ledgers and survey maps. But I had a stubbornness in me even then quieter than my mother's, sharper than my father's, and when the district office announced an opening for a records clerk who could read and write clearly, I walked the 11 kilometers into town myself and asked for the position before anyone in my family knew I had left the house. The office smelled of dust and old paper and the particular mustiness of ink that had dried decades before I was born. I learned to read hand-drawn boundary maps under a single bare bulb that flickered whenever the generator faltered. I learned the weight of responsibility that came with a stamp and a signature, that a single mark on a piece of paper could determine whether a family kept the home their grandparents built or lost it to a neighbor's forged claim. I took that responsibility seriously in a way that, looking back, probably made me insufferable to work alongside. But it also made me good at my job. Very good. It was in that office, 3 years into my employment, that I met my husband. He came in carrying a rolled survey map under one arm and an apology already forming on his lips because he was 20 minutes late for an appointment. And the previous clerk had a reputation for turning latecomers away without mercy. I was not that clerk. I looked at his map, a boundary dispute between his family's ancestral land and a neighboring plot, and instead of sending him away, I sat with him for 2 hours that afternoon, tracing old surveys, comparing measurements, drinking tea that had gone cold twice over, because neither of us wanted to stop and reheat it. He told me later, years later, lying beside me one quiet evening with the window open to the sound of cicadas, that he had fallen in love with me somewhere between the second cup of tea and the moment I corrected an error in the district's own paperwork without flinching, without apologizing, simply because it was wrong and needed fixing. You looked like you owned the truth itself, he said. Like it was yours to hand out, a little at a time, to whoever deserved it. We married the following spring. He built this house with help from his brothers, the same house I still live in. The same wooden beams, now darkened with 40 years of cooking, smoke, and incense, the same uneven floor tile near the kitchen door, that he always meant to fix and never did. The ancestral land, the parcel his own parents had carved out and registered through proper channels, through the very office where I worked, became something sacred between us. Not because of its size, it was modest, barely enough for a small rice plot and the family graves at its northern edge, but because of what it represented. Continuity, roots that did not move even when everything else in the country seemed to. When his parents grew old, it was understood, the way these things are understood without ever needing to be spoken aloud, that the land would remain in the family, undivided, used only for the ancestral graves, and the small shrine his father had built beside the old banyan tree. His father wrote it down himself, in his own careful hand, with the district office's seal pressed into the corner of the page. Land for remembrance, not for sale, not for division. I filed that document myself, decades before I ever imagined I would need to retrieve it again. Kai was born 4 years into our marriage, in the back room of this very house, with the midwife's hand steady and my husband pacing the courtyard outside until he heard the first cry. I remember holding him for the first time and feeling something shift permanently inside my chest, a weight settling into place that never fully lifted again, not even now, not even after everything. He was a gentle boy. Quiet, easily moved to tears by small kindnesses, the kind of child who cried when he accidentally stepped on insects in the garden. I used to worry, privately, that the world would be too hard on a boy with such a soft center. I worried about the wrong thing entirely. The world was never the danger. The danger came from someone he chose to bring into this house, someone with a softness of her own, though hers, I would learn, was the kind that only ever pointed outward, never in. My husband passed 5 years ago, in early spring, when the plum blossoms were just beginning to open along the courtyard wall. He went quietly, in his sleep, his hand still loosely curled around mine, where I had fallen asleep beside the bed the night before. I lit the first incense stick at his altar before the sun had fully risen, and I have lit one every morning since, the smoke curling upward in thin gray ribbons that catch the early light through the window and seem, for just a moment, like something almost alive. I thought, in the quiet years that followed, that grief would be the hardest thing I'd face without him beside me. I was wrong about that too. Grief, at least, asks nothing of you but time. It does not lie to your face. It does not smile while reaching for what is yours. I did not yet know, in those first peaceful years of widowhood, tending the altar, walking the same dirt paths I had walked as a younger woman, that the harder test was still waiting for me, quiet, patient, gathering itself in the shape of my own son's house. It began, as these things often do, with something small enough to dismiss. Yenvai came to visit on a Sunday in early autumn, carrying a basket of dragon fruit. She said she'd bought specially because she remembered I liked them. She sat with me on the porch while Kai busied himself fixing a loose hinge on the gate, and she asked, in that soft, considerate voice she always used when she wanted something, whether I had given any thought to simplifying things. Simplifying, she said, so it's easier for everyone, later. I asked her what she meant by later. She laughed lightly, waved a hand as if brushing the question away like a fly. Oh, mother, you know. Just in case. Paperwork gets complicated when people get older. It would be easier if Kai's name were already on the land registration, so there's no confusion for anyone down the road. I told her the land was registered properly, that it had been registered properly for over 50 years, since my husband's father first walked it into the district office himself. Of course, she said. I just mean updating it. Modernizing the paperwork. You know how these old documents can get damaged, lost. It would put everyone's mind at ease if we just had it transferred into Kai's name now, while you're still here to oversee it. While you're still here. I noted the phrase the way I used to note small irregularities in old survey records, not because they screamed for attention, but because experience had taught me that the smallest inconsistencies were often where the larger lies began to show their seams. I told her I would think about it. I did not tell her that I had already begun thinking about very little else. 2 weeks later, she returned alone, without the basket of fruit this time, without the soft opening pleasantries. She came directly to the point in a way that surprised me, though I did not let it show on my face. Mother, I think it would be safer if I held on to the land deed for now, just to keep it organized with the other family documents. You know how these things can get misplaced. She smiled as she said it, the same smile she'd worn the day she first mentioned dragon fruit, the same smile that never once reached her eyes. I looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose shutter on the kitchen window. The one Kai's father, my husband, had meant to repair the autumn before he died. The sound of it knocking against the frame filled the silence between us, steady and a little ominous, like a small, persistent warning. "The deed is in the family safe," I said. "It has been there since your father-in-law placed it there himself." "I know, Mother. But I worry about you, living alone, papers scattered everywhere. It would just be simpler if I kept it with the other important documents at our place, for safekeeping." For safekeeping, another phrase I noted carefully, filed away in the same quiet part of my mind, where I had once filed boundary disputes and forged claims, back when that was my livelihood rather than my private vigilance. I did not refuse her outright. I have learned, over many decades, that refusing someone directly only teaches them to come at you sideways the next time, more carefully disguised. Instead, I told her I would consider it, that I needed a few days to think, the same answer I had given about modernizing the paperwork. But that night, after she left, I sat alone in the front room with only the altar candles for light, and I opened the old metal safe my husband had bolted into the floor of our bedroom closet decades earlier. I took out the deed, the modern registration certificate, the one everyone in the family knew about, the one Yenvi was so eager to safeguard, and I held it in my hands for a long time, feeling the slight roughness of its official seal beneath my thumb. I thought of my husband's father, writing out his wishes in his own careful hand. The document I had personally filed at the district office before either of my children were born. I thought of how few people remembered that document even existed, how, in the rush of modern registration certificates and updated paperwork, the original allocation record had simply faded into the back of everyone's memory, myself excluded. I made my decision that night, though I told no one. I would let Yenvi believe she had won this small, careful battle. I would hand her the modern deed when she asked again, smiling, expressing gratitude for her thoughtfulness. Let her think the matter settled. Let her and my son believe, for as long as it served my purposes, that the path ahead was clear. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, was that the modern deed was not the only document that mattered. It had never been the only document that mattered. And a woman who had spent 40 years filing other families' land disputes does not forget, under any circumstance, where the oldest and truest record of a family's land is kept. She would have her victory. It would simply not be the one she imagined. The first real sign came on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary afternoon that gives no warning of what it's about to deliver. I had gone to the market early, before the heat settled too heavily over the stalls, to buy ginger and the small green chilies I liked for my soup. On my way back, my phone rang an old habit I'd never fully grown used to. This small rectangle of glass and plastic that connected me to a world that moved faster than I sometimes cared to follow. I almost let it ring through. I am glad, now, that I did not. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, brisk, businesslike. A man introducing himself as a property broker, asking with the casual confidence of someone reading from a script he'd used 100 times before whether I was still interested in the listing for the ancestral parcel near the old banyan tree. I stood very still in the middle of the dirt road, the bag of ginger growing heavy in my hand, the afternoon sun pressing warm against the back of my neck. "What listing?" I said. My voice did not rise. It almost never does, even when something inside me has gone suddenly and completely cold. There was a pause on the other end, the small hesitation of a man realizing, a beat too late, that he had perhaps called the wrong number, or the right number but the wrong person. "I apologize. I may have the wrong contact. I was given this number by Mr. Kai regarding the land near." I did not let him finish. I asked him, very calmly, to send me whatever listing information he had. I gave him my full name. I told him I was the registered landholder. The silence that followed was longer this time, heavier, the silence of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the transaction he believed he was a small part of. He sent the listing 20 minutes later, while I was still walking home, the ginger bag swinging gently against my leg with each step. I sat on the low stone bench just outside my courtyard gate and opened the message with hands that, for the first time in a very long while, were not entirely steady. There it was. Photographs of the land, the rice paddy, the edge of the family graves visible at the corner of one image, the old banyan tree standing exactly where it had stood since before I was born. A listing price. A description praising the parcel's prime location and clear title, ready for transfer. And beneath it, a contact name, Dang Vun Hai, my own son's name, sitting beneath a listing for land that was never his to sell, land his own grandfather had written, in his own hand, was meant only for remembrance. I sat on that bench for a long time after reading it. The wind moved through the bamboo at the edge of the courtyard. That particular dry rustle that always sounds, to me, like something whispering just beyond the range of understanding. Inside the house, through the open door, I could see the thin gray thread of incense smoke, still rising from the altar, undisturbed, unaware, curling upward into the dim afternoon light exactly as it had every morning for 5 years. I thought of my husband's face in the photograph on that altar, steady, a little amused, watching me the way he always had. I thought of the careful document his father had written, the one I had filed myself decades earlier, the one almost everyone in this family had long since forgotten existed. I did not call Kai. I did not call Yen Vai. I sat very still, the listing glowing faintly on the small screen in my hands, and I felt something settle inside me, not panic, not the trembling fear I might have expected from a woman my age. Discovering her own son had begun selling away her husband's family gravesite behind her back. What I felt instead was quieter than that, and far more dangerous to anyone standing in its way. Still, water runs the deepest, my mother used to say. I rose from the bench, smoothed the front of my al-baba with one steady hand, and walked into the house. I passed the altar without stopping, though I paused just long enough to look at my husband's photograph one more time. I went straight to the bedroom closet, to the old metal safe bolted into the floor, the one only I knew the full combination to, and there, beneath the modern deed, Yen Vai had already half convinced herself she would soon possess. My fingers found the edge of something older, something thinner, more fragile, its paso, its paper gone soft, and slightly yellowed at the corners. I did not open it yet. I simply held it in my hands, in the dim closet light, and listened to the wind picking up outside, rattling the same loose shutter my husband had never gotten around to fixing. Somewhere in this house, a second secret was waiting to be found, and I had only just discovered the first one. The document I pulled from beneath the modern deed was not the one I expected to find first. It was thin, almost translucent at the folds where decades of handling had worn the paper soft, and the ink had faded to a brownish gray that made the old characters look more like memory than writing. I recognized it instantly, not because I had seen it recently, but because I had filed it myself, 41 years ago, in the district office where I once worked, back when the registration stamps were still pressed by hand and the seal ink smelled faintly of vinegar. It was my father-in-law's allocation record, the one declaring the parcel near the banyan tree as ancestral land, reserved permanently for the family graves, and the small shrine, never to be sold, never to be divided. I had not needed to read it that night. I knew every line of it already. What I needed, instead, was something else entirely, something I found only after setting that old record carefully aside and reaching deeper into the safe, toward a slim folder I had not opened in over a year. Bank statements. Mine, printed quarterly, the way I had always insisted on receiving them. A habit left over from decades of distrusting digital systems that could be altered with the press of a few keys. I sat on the closet floor, with my back against the cool concrete wall, the folder open across my knees, and I went through each page slowly, the way I once reviewed contested boundary surveys, looking not for what was obviously wrong, but for what was almost right. I found it on the third page. A withdrawal, 8 months earlier, for an amount nearly equal to half my husband's pension savings, the money set aside, quietly, over years, for the cost of my own eventual funeral rites, so that Kai would never have to bear that burden alone. I had not made that withdrawal. I remembered, with sudden and sickening clarity, the afternoon Yen Vai had visited with a folder of papers, asking me to sign what she called a routine update to my savings account, something about new banking regulations, requiring elderly account holders to re-verify their signatures. I had signed without reading closely. She had been so patient that day, so gentle, refilling my tea twice while I bent over the paperwork with my reading glasses slipping down my nose. My hands went cold around the folder. I turned the page and found a second withdrawal, 3 months after the first, smaller but still substantial, taken under the same circumstances, another visit, another folder, another patient afternoon of tea, and quiet conversation, while I signed what I believed were minor administrative forms. Together, the 2 withdrawals accounted for nearly all the money my husband and I had saved across 40 years of careful, deliberate frugality. Money meant for incense, for the proper rites, for the kind of funeral that honors a life rather than rushing through it. Gone. Not stolen in the dramatic way one reads about in newspapers, but siphoned away quietly, politely, with a smile and a cup of tea, the way water finds the smallest crack in a dam and widens it so slowly you don't notice the wall is failing until the flood is already at your door. I sat very still in that closet for a long time. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the bamboo grove at the edge of our land, that same dry whispering sound, steady and patient, as if the bamboo itself were trying to tell me something I had not yet fully understood. It is said, in the old way of speaking, that bamboo bends in the storm but rarely breaks, that its strength lies not in rigidity, but in its willingness to sway without losing its roots. I thought of that as I sat there, the folder trembling slightly, now in my hands, despite my best effort to keep them steady. I had spent 5 years bending quietly under the weight of widowhood, under the slow erosion of a son's attention, under the patient, polite cruelty of a daughter-in-law who smiled while she pulled threads loose from the fabric of everything I had built. But bamboo that bends is still rooted. It does not simply lie down and let the storm carry it away. I closed the folder. I returned both documents, the old allocation record and the bank statements, to the bottom of the safe, beneath a stack of my husband's folded shirts, exactly where they had been before, as though nothing had been disturbed at all. I locked the safe with the same careful, unhurried motion I used every evening when checking the front gate before bed. Then I went to the kitchen, lit the stove, and began preparing dinner as if it were any other Tuesday. When Kai came home that evening, tired from a long day of property showings that had apparently gone nowhere, he found his mother sitting at the table, exactly where she always sat, a bowl of soup already steaming in front of his usual seat, her expression as calm and unreadable as it had been every evening for the past 5 years. "You're quiet tonight, Mother," he said, settling into his chair. "I am always quiet," I said, and ladled more soup into his bowl before he could ask anything further. He did not press the matter. He never did. That had always been his particular weakness, and I was beginning to understand, perhaps the very weakness someone else in this house had learned, quite deliberately, exactly how to use against him. I watched him eat in silence, his eyes occasionally drifting toward his phone where it sat face down beside his bowl, lighting up every few minutes with messages he made a small, practiced effort not to glance at while I was watching. I said nothing about the listing. I said nothing about the withdrawals. I simply watched my son eat the soup I had made him, the way I had made it for him 1,000 times before, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised even me, that the time for watching quietly was drawing to its end. Whatever they believed they had already taken from me, they had not yet seen what they had truly disturbed. I telephoned the district land office the following morning, before the heat of the day had fully settled over the courtyard, and asked to speak with someone in records retention. The young man who answered sounded surprised to hear from someone requesting archived files dating back over 4 decades. Most people, he told me with the gentle condescension reserved for elderly callers, simply assumed records that old no longer existed, lost to flooding or fire, or the simple passage of time. I told him, calmly, that I had filed those particular records myself, in this very office, and that I happened to know precisely which cabinet they would be found in, provided the building's layout had not changed too drastically since 1983. There was a pause on the line. Then, with a different tone entirely, something closer to respect, he asked for my name again. When I gave it, the pause grew longer still. "You're the Mrs. Hahn who trained half the senior clerks here," he said. It was not quite a question. I admitted that I was. Within the week, I had in hand a certified copy of the original allocation record, freshly stamped, its provenance now beyond any reasonable dispute. I drove into town myself to collect it rather than waiting for it to be mailed, taking the early bus the way I used to when I was a younger woman commuting to the very desk where this document had first been filed. The clerk who handed it to me across the counter could not have been older than 30, and he looked at me with the particular curiosity of someone meeting a small piece of institutional legend he had only heard about secondhand. "They still talk about you here," he said, almost shyly. The clerk who caught the family forgery, back before computers. I smiled, just slightly, and told him that some habits never really leave a person, no matter how many years pass between the using of them. I did not stop there. Over the following 2 weeks, working quietly and without announcing my intentions to anyone in the house, I made several more careful inquiries. I visited the small private bank branch in town, the one where Kai had recently opened a new account information. I gathered not through any dramatic confrontation, but simply by asking the manager, an old acquaintance from my working years, whether anything unusual had crossed his desk recently involving my family's name. He told me, with the easy candor of a man who saw no harm in the question, that Kai had indeed opened a new account roughly 8 months earlier, and that 2 notably large deposits had been made into it not long after, deposits whose dates aligned, with uncomfortable precision, against the 2 withdrawals I had already found in my own bank statements. I wrote everything down in a small notebook I kept in the drawer beside my bed, the same kind of notebook I had once used to record contested boundary measurements. Dates, amounts, names, the careful architecture of a deception built one polite, smiling visit at a time. There is an old saying my mother used to repeat whenever neighbors gossip too freely in the marketplace. The river that looks calmest on the surface is often the one hiding the strongest current beneath. I had spent 5 years appearing calm, a quiet widow, tending her altar, walking the same familiar paths each morning. Beneath that surface, I had simply been gathering the current that would, eventually, need somewhere to go. I confess there was a small, private satisfaction in this work. One I did not examine too closely at the time, fearing it might curdle into something less dignified than vigilance. Each document I retrieved, each quiet confirmation from an old colleague or acquaintance, felt like setting a single stone back into its proper place along a wall that had been slowly, deliberately dismantled behind my back. I thought, more than once during those 2 weeks, of my husband watching from his place above the altar, and what he might have said had he been beside me instead of merely overlooking the room from his photograph. He had always trusted Kai completely, perhaps too completely, the way fathers sometimes trust the soft-hearted sons they worry the world will be too harsh toward. I wondered whether he would be heartbroken now, watching what his gentleness had grown into, or whether he would simply nod the way he always did when I uncovered some inconsistency at the office, a small, approving nod that said, "Of course you found it. You always do." By the end of the 2nd week, I had assembled enough to understand the full shape of what had happened, even if I did not yet understand precisely why. The land listing, the forged authorization for the withdrawals, the new account quietly receiving the proceeds. Whatever Kai and Yenvi believed they were building toward, they were building it on a foundation I had already begun, piece by piece, to expose to daylight. I did not yet know how deep the foundation truly went. I would learn that soon enough, and the learning of it would cost me more than any document or bank statement ever could. Yenvi arrived on a Thursday afternoon with the particular brightness of someone who believed every remaining obstacle had already been cleared from her path. She came bearing gifts again, this time not dragon fruit, but an expensive set of silk scarves, the kind sold in the boutique shops near the provincial capital, far beyond what someone in her position would typically spend on a mother-in-law. She'd been quietly stripping of land and savings for the better part of a year. She draped one across my shoulders herself, smoothing it with both hands the way you might dress a child, or perhaps the way you might dress someone you no longer expected to need warm clothing for very much longer. You deserve nice things, Mother, she said, settling into the chair across from me with the easy confidence of a woman who had already, in her own mind, finished winning. After everything you've given this family, I let the scarf rest against my shoulders and said nothing. Watching her the way I once watched contested parties across a negotiation table, waiting for the moment they revealed, without quite meaning to, exactly how much they believed they had already secured. She did not make me wait long. Kai and I have been talking, she said, pouring herself tea without waiting to be offered any. Another small shift in the household's quiet hierarchy that I noted and filed away without comment. About your comfort. Going forward. The house here is large for one person. The upkeep, the walking back and forth to the market, the stairs to the altar room. It must be exhausting at your age. I manage well enough, I said. Of course you do. You've always managed everything beautifully. Her smile widened, warm and entirely false. But we worry. There's a lovely retirement community 2 districts over, clean, modern, other women your age to keep you company. We could visit together this weekend. Just to look. I asked her, mildly, what would become of the house and the land, should I agree to such a visit. We'd take care of everything. She said quickly, too quickly, the practiced patience slipping for just a fraction of a second before she caught herself and smoothed it back into place. You wouldn't have to worry about any of it. Kai already has a buyer interested in the parcel near the banyan tree. A very generous offer, actually. More than enough to cover a comfortable place for you to live out your years in peace, without all this responsibility weighing on you. There it was, stated plainly, almost casually, as though she were offering me a kindness rather than confessing to me, indirectly, exactly what she and my son had already set into motion. I asked her how soon this buyer intended to proceed. Within the month, if all the paperwork goes smoothly, she said. We just need your signature on a few final documents, nothing complicated, just formalizing the transfer so everyone's protected. A few final documents. I understood, in that moment, with a clarity sharp enough to make the tea in my hands feel suddenly very heavy, that they intended to obtain my actual signature this time, not a forged one, not a quietly substituted form, slipped beneath routine banking paperwork, but my own hand, freely given, on a document that would erase, permanently and beyond any future dispute, my husband's father's wishes for that land. They believed, I realized, that they had already won. The withdrawals had gone unnoticed, or so they assumed. The listing had drawn a buyer. All that remained was the final formality of persuading a tired old widow to sign away what little resistance she had left. Perhaps with the gentle pressure of a retirement community brochure and the promise of an easier life. I looked at Yen Vi across the table, at her bright, expectant expression, at the silk scarf still draped warmly across my shoulders, and I felt something settle inside me with the cold, total stillness of floodwater reaching its final, highest mark before it begins, inevitably, to recede. Let me think it over, I said. These are large decisions for someone my age. I wouldn't want to rush something so important. Her smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes recalculated, quickly and silently, the way a merchant recalculates a price when a customer hesitates a moment longer than expected. Of course, Mother, take all the time you need. Just not too much time. These offers don't wait forever. She left an hour later, the empty teacup still warm on the table, the silk scarf still resting across my shoulders like something I had not yet decided whether to keep or discard. I sat alone in the front room as the afternoon light shifted gold, then amber, then the deep blue-gray of early evening, and I thought of my husband's father writing his careful wishes onto a thin sheet of paper more than 40 years earlier, never once imagining that his own grandson would one day stand ready to erase them with nothing more than a borrowed pen and a tired old woman's signature. They believed the storm had already passed, that the worst of the resistance had already been weathered, that all that remained now was the quiet, easy work of collecting what they'd come for. They had no understanding, none at all, of what was still gathering, slow and silent, just beyond the edge of what they could see. It was Tu Lan who brought me the truth that broke something loose inside my chest, not anger exactly, though anger was certainly part of it, but something closer to grief revisited, an old wound reopened by a hand I had trusted. He came to the house just after dusk, still in his security guard's uniform from the notary office in town. His bicycle leaned hastily against the courtyard gate, his face carrying the particular pallor of a man who has seen something he wishes, quite desperately. He had not. "Ko-han," he said, using the old respectful address he'd used since he was a boy sitting at my husband's feet, learning his letters in the evenings when the village school had no teacher to spare. "I need to show you something. I think you need to see it before anyone else does." He had photographed, quietly, and at considerable risk to his own position, a folder left open on the notary's desk during a meeting he had not been meant to overhear. Inside the folder, alongside the property listing I had already discovered weeks earlier, was a document I had not yet seen a power of attorney form, prepared and ready for signature, granting Kai full authority to sell the ancestral parcel on my behalf, citing, in the careful legal language designed to anticipate any future challenge, my advancing age and occasional memory lapses, as justification for the transfer of authority. Beneath that form, clipped together with chilling administrative neatness, was a second document, a draft death notice and funeral arrangement plan, prepared in advance, listing a retirement community in the next district as my current residence at the time of passing. I held my phone with both hands as I scrolled through the photographs Tu Lan had taken, and the room around me seemed, for a long moment, to tilt slightly, the way a boat tilts when a wave arrives larger than expected. They had not simply been planning to ease me gently into a smaller, quieter life somewhere else. They had been planning, with careful administrative precision, for my eventual death, not causing it, I understood, not in any direct sense, but anticipating it, preparing the paperwork for it in advance, structuring the entire transaction, so that whether I died naturally in some retirement facility, 2 districts away, or simply faded slowly out of relevance in my own home, the outcome for them would be identical. The land would be sold, the money would be theirs, and I would be, in either case, a small administrative detail already accounted for. I thought of my husband then, more vividly and painfully than I had in years, not his photograph on the altar, calm and frozen in time, but the actual man, the warmth of his hand, the particular sound of his laugh on the evenings we sat together on this very porch, watching the rice fields turn gold in the late afternoon light. I thought of him standing in the courtyard the day Kai was born, pacing with an anxious joy I had teased him about for years afterward. I thought of the careful, loving way he had taught his son to walk, to read, to treat his elders with the gentleness he himself had always shown. And I thought of how completely, how thoroughly, that gentleness had been hollowed out and refilled with something else entirely, not by Kai alone, I suspected, but by a slow erosion neither of us had been watching closely enough to stop. Tears came then, the first I had allowed myself since the morning my husband died. They came quietly, without sound, the way rain sometimes falls so gently, you only notice it by the dampness gathering on your skin. I did not wipe them away immediately. I let them fall onto the screen of my phone, onto the photographed evidence of my own son's willingness to file paperwork for my death, before I had even decided whether to die. Tu Lan sat beside me in silence, his hands folded awkwardly in his lap, unsure whether comfort was something I would welcome, or whether silence itself was the more appropriate gift. "I am sorry, Ko-han," he finally said. "I almost didn't come. I was afraid of what it would do to you, seeing this." I wiped my face with the edge of the silk scarf Yen Vai had given me only days earlier, an irony I noted even through my grief. And I told him, in a voice steadier than I expected to find, that he had done exactly right in bringing it to me, that the only thing crueler than this truth would have been not knowing it at all, continuing to pour tea, continuing to smile politely, continuing to walk unknowingly toward a fate already documented in someone else's neat administrative folder. The wind picked up outside as the last light faded from the sky, rattling the same loose shutter that had never been repaired. The sound suddenly less like a small domestic annoyance and more like something insistent, something demanding to be heard. I thought of the old saying about the calm river hiding its strongest current, but what I felt now was no longer current. It was the full, gathering weight of the flood itself. Finally arriving, I sat with Toulon until the incense on the altar had burned down to its last fragrant ember, and somewhere in the quiet hours that followed, my grief began, slowly and deliberately, to harden into something else entirely. Something with a shape, something with a purpose, something that would not be stopped now by any amount of silk scarves or polite, smiling tea. I did not confront them. I have learned, across a lifetime spent untangling other people's disputes, that confrontation too early only teaches the dishonest to grow more careful, more cautious, better at concealing whatever remains undiscovered. What I needed instead was patience, the same patience that had once let me sit for hours over contested boundary surveys, waiting for the single inconsistency that would unravel an entire fraudulent claim. I called the district office again, this time asking specifically for the deputy director, a woman named Colleen, who had once been my junior clerk decades earlier, back when we were both young women, learning the weight of an official stamp. She remembered me instantly, and when I explained, carefully and without excessive emotion, what I had discovered: the forged banking authorizations, the listing for ancestral land, the power of attorney prepared in anticipation of my advancing memory lapses, the funeral arrangements drafted in advance of any actual death, her voice on the other end of the line grew very quiet, very serious. "Kohan," she said, "bring everything you have, all of it. We'll need to involve the commune's legal officer as well, given the severity of what you're describing." I spent the following days assembling what I had gathered: the certified copy of the original allocation record, my bank statements showing the 2 unauthorized withdrawals, the photographs Toulon had carefully and quietly preserved, my own notebook of dates and names recorded with the same precision I once applied to official surveys. I laid it all out across my husband's writing desk one evening, the same desk where his unfinished wristwatch still sat in the drawer beneath his folded shirts, and I felt, looking at the assembled weight of it, something close to the calm clarity I used to feel just before presenting an airtight case to a district arbitration panel. I told no one in the house what I was preparing. I continued pouring tea each evening. I continued ladling soup into Kai's bowl, continued accepting Yenvai's visits with the same polite, unreadable smile I had worn for months. Let them believe, a little longer, that the silence meant surrender. Let them believe the storm had passed quietly, the way storms sometimes do over still water, leaving no visible disturbance on the surface. Colleen called me back 3 days later to confirm what I had already suspected: the power of attorney document had not yet been filed, the buyer's deposit had not yet cleared, the sale was not yet final. There was still time, not much, but enough, provided I moved carefully and did not allow Kai or Yenvai a single moment's warning before everything I had gathered could be brought forward at once, undeniable and complete. I thought, that evening, of the bamboo grove at the edge of our land, swaying steadily in the evening wind, bending without ever once losing its roots. I had bent for months, quietly, patiently, allowing them to believe their plans were proceeding exactly as intended. But bending, I understood now more clearly than ever, was never the same as breaking. It had simply been the necessary shape required to gather strength for what came next. I lit a fresh stick of incense at my husband's altar that night, watching the thin gray smoke curl upward into the dim evening light, and I spoke to his photograph in a voice barely above a whisper, the way I sometimes did when the house grew too quiet and the loneliness pressed too heavily against my chest. I am sorry it has come to this, I told him. I know you loved him. I loved him too. Once. The boy he was before all of this, but I will not let your father's wishes be erased by a signature taken under false comfort, and I will not let what remains of our family's roots be sold off to settle someone else's debts. The candle flame beside his photograph flickered once, steadied, and held. I checked the calendar the following morning and circled a date 2 weeks ahead, the date Yen Vi had mentioned, almost in passing, as the deadline for finalizing the buyer's paperwork. 2 weeks to ensure every document was properly certified, every witness properly informed, every piece of evidence arranged in the precise order needed to leave no room for doubt or delay. Kai came home that evening looking distracted, his phone buzzing more frequently than usual against the kitchen table, his eyes occasionally darting toward me, with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a small boy, suspecting, without quite knowing why, that his mother already understood something he had hoped to keep hidden a little longer. I said nothing. I simply ladled his soup, the way I always did, and watched the steam rise between us, like something quietly building toward a reckoning. Neither of them yet understood was already underway. Outside, far off toward the mountains, the sky had begun to darken early, clouds gathering low and heavy along the horizon in a way that, in this part of the country, almost always meant rain was coming before the week's end, the kind of storm that arrives slowly, announces itself for days in the wind and the air pressure and the restless behavior of the birds, and then, when it finally breaks completely. The notary office in town was small, plain, the kind of government building that had not changed its furniture in 20 years. Fluorescent lights, a long table with mismatched chairs, a ceiling fan that turned slowly overhead and did little to cut through the mid-morning heat. It was, I thought, a fittingly unremarkable place for something that would change the entire shape of my family's future. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed simply in my usual brown ao ba ba, my hair pinned in its familiar low bun, carrying nothing but a worn cloth folder beneath my arm. Ko Lian had arranged everything precisely as I'd asked quietly, without alerting Kai or Yen Vi to anything beyond a routine final signing. They had no reason to suspect otherwise. As far as they understood, this was simply the day their patience would finally be rewarded. They arrived together a few minutes later. Yen Vi in a new ao dye, the pale blue of expensive silk, Kai trailing slightly behind her the way he always did now, as though he had long ago stopped leading and simply learned to follow. The buyer arrived shortly after a heavyset man named Mr. Fuok, accompanied by his own lawyer, both of them already glancing at their watches with the particular impatience of men eager to close a profitable transaction and move on to the next one. The notary, a careful young woman named Ko Tham, laid the paperwork across the table and began the formal preamble required before any signature could be collected. I watched Yen Vi's hands rest lightly on the table's edge, her expression bright, victorious, already halfway to wherever she imagined her life would go once this final piece was in place. Before we begin, I said, and my voice, though quiet, was steady enough to still every other sound in the room. I have some documents of my own that need to be entered into the record. Yen Vi's smile flickered, just slightly, the way a candle flickers when a door opens somewhere unseen. I opened the cloth folder and laid the contents across the table, one piece at a time, the way I had once laid contested survey documents before arbitration panels decades earlier. Slowly, deliberately, allowing each item its own moment of silence before the next was revealed. The certified copy of my father-in-law's original allocation record came first, its old characters faded but unmistakably legible, the district seal still crisp despite the document's age. I watched Ko Tham's eyes move across it, then widen slightly with understanding. This parcel, I said, was registered over 40 years ago as ancestral land, reserved permanently for burial and remembrance, not for sale, not for transfer. The terms are stated clearly, and I filed this record myself when I worked in this very office. Kai's face had gone pale, Yenvi's hand tightened almost imperceptibly against the table's edge. Next came the bank statements, the 2 unauthorized withdrawals highlighted in red ink, alongside copies of the forms I had unknowingly signed during what I'd believed were routine banking updates. These funds, I said, were taken from my personal savings under false pretenses, while I was led to believe I was signing administrative paperwork rather than authorizations for withdrawal. Mr. Fouque shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His lawyer leaned forward, suddenly far more interested in the documents than in the clock on the wall. Then, last, I laid out the photographs Toulon had taken the prepared power of attorney, citing my advancing memory lapses, and beside it, the draft death notice and funeral plan, prepared in careful administrative advance of any actual passing. The room went very quiet. My son and his wife, I said, my eyes moving from the documents to Kai's face, holding there for a long moment, have prepared paperwork for my death before I have died. They cited a memory they invented to justify taking authority I never granted them, over land that was never theirs to sell. Yenvi found her voice first, though it came out sharper than she likely intended, the polished gentleness she'd worn for months finally cracking under pressure. Mother, there's been some kind of misunderstanding. We were only trying to help, to make things easier for you. You said, I said quietly, that I should sign away the deed because I might forget where it was kept. I let the silence stretch a moment. The same silence I had offered her months earlier across my own front room. The silence that had unsettled her then and seemed to unsettle her even more now, surrounded by witnesses who were no longer simply family. I have not forgotten a single document in this folder. I filed half of them myself, before either of you understood what a land registry even was. Ko Tham, the notary, set down her pen entirely and looked between us with the careful neutrality of someone whose professional duty had just shifted dramatically. Given what's been presented, she said slowly, I cannot proceed with this transfer. This appears to constitute fraud against the registered landholder, and possibly elder financial exploitation. I'll need to refer this matter to the district legal officer immediately. Mr. Fouque rose from his chair, so quickly it scraped loudly against the tile floor. I had no knowledge of any of this, he said, already gathering his briefcase, his earlier eagerness collapsing into something closer to panic. My deposit. I want my deposit returned in full, and I want no further part of this transaction. His lawyer was already on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. Kai had not said a word through any of it. He sat very still, staring at the photographed funeral plan still lying open on the table between us, his own signature visible at the bottom corner, where he had authorized the document's preparation weeks earlier. I watched something break open behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, but the particular collapse of a man finally seeing, all at once, the full shape of what he had allowed himself to become. Dad would be, he started, and stopped himself, unable to finish the sentence, unable to summon his father's name in the same room as the evidence of what he had nearly done to his father's wishes. Your father wrote that land into the family's keeping before you were even born, I said. He trusted it would still be there for his own grandchildren, whenever they came. He never imagined it would need protecting from his son. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The silence of the room itself had become the verdict, the same silence I had offered, months ago, in answer to a question that had never deserved one. The collapse, once it began, moved faster than I had expected. Within the hour, the district legal officer had arrived in person, summoned directly by Ko Tham, and what had begun as a routine property transfer became, in the span of a single morning, a formal inquiry into elder financial fraud. Mr. Fouque's lawyer, eager to distance his client from any appearance of complicity, voluntarily handed over the full record of the listing arrangement, including messages between himself and Kai, discussing the sale weeks before any of the supposedly final paperwork had ever reached my hands. It was in reviewing those messages, laid out plainly, before the legal officer, that the true depth of the betrayal between Kai and Yenvi themselves began, unexpectedly, to surface. You told me she'd already agreed. Kai said, his voice rising for the first time that morning, turning toward his wife with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a boy caught in some small, indefensibly lie. You told me Mother understood, that she wanted this, that she'd be relieved not to carry the burden anymore. I told you what needed to be told. Yen Vi snapped back, the careful softness she'd cultivated for months finally, completely abandoning her. Someone in this family had to be practical. You were too busy feeling guilty to actually do anything about our debts. The legal officer, a stern, unhurried woman named Ko Bitch, raised a hand for silence, though the silence she received was thinner now, charged with the particular electricity of two people realizing, in real time, that their carefully maintained partnership had been built on entirely different understandings of what the other was willing to sacrifice. It was Ko Bitch's questions, careful and procedural, that drew out the rest. The debts, Yen V's, accumulated quietly over 2 years through a private lending arrangement she had kept hidden from Kai for most of their marriage. The same debts that had quietly justified, in her own mind, every withdrawal and every forged signature. Kai had known about some of it, enough to feel complicit, not enough to understand the full weight of what his wife had been orchestrating beneath his nervous, guilty cooperation. You used my father's name, Kai said, quieter now, the anger draining into something closer to grief. You used him to convince me this was somehow honoring the family, paying off our debts before they ruined us. You never once mentioned the deposits going straight into your private account. Yen Vi did not answer him. Her silence, unlike mine, carried no patience in it at all, only the particular brittleness of someone who has run out of explanations and has not yet decided which version of denial to attempt next. Ko Bitch gathered the documents methodically, noting each piece for the formal record, the forged authorizations, the prematurely drafted funeral arrangements, the listing correspondence predating any actual agreement from me. This will require formal review, she said. Given the severity, particularly the documentation prepared regarding Mrs. Han's anticipated death, I would not be surprised if this proceeds beyond a civil matter into criminal investigation territory. I watched my son's face, as those words settled over him, watched the particular paling that comes when a person finally understands, fully, and without any remaining room for self-deception, the size of the hole he has dug for himself. He did not look at his wife. He looked at me. Instead, for a long moment, his eyes wet, his jaw working silently around words he could not yet seem to organize into anything coherent. I never wanted you gone, Mother, he finally managed. I only wanted the debts gone. I told myself it was the same thing, if it meant peace in the house. I told myself you'd understand, eventually, that it was for the family. You told yourself many things, I said. And though my voice remained quiet, there was nothing soft left in it now. But you signed paperwork, preparing for my funeral, while I was still pouring your soup every evening. There is no version of family that excuses that. He had no answer for that. There wasn't one to give. By early afternoon, the matter had moved entirely out of my hands and into the proper legal channels, exactly where I had intended it to go from the moment I first laid those documents across the table. Mr. Fuok's deposit was formally voided. The listing was withdrawn. The power of attorney, never filed, was confiscated as evidence. Yen Vi was escorted out separately from Kai, her composure finally, completely abandoned, her voice rising in the hallway in a final, furious stream of blame directed at everyone but herself. Kai remained behind, a moment longer, standing alone in the small notary office, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the ceiling fan still turning its slow, useless circles against the heat. What happens now? He asked. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, he sounded entirely like a child again. Lost, frightened, uncertain of the ground beneath his own feet. Now, I said, gathering my folder and rising slowly from my chair, the truth finishes the work I only had to begin. I did not destroy what you built. You did that yourselves. The moment you decided a piece of paper was worth more than honesty. I left him standing there in the quiet office, the door swinging shut softly behind me, the midday sun bright and indifferent over the dusty street outside, where the storm that had been gathering for so many silent months had, at last, fully and completely broken. The land near the banyan tree is quiet again now, the way it was always meant to be. I walk out there most mornings, before the heat settles too heavily over the rice paddies, the same dirt path I have walked since I was a young bride, following my husband out to see the boundaries his own father once measured, with nothing more than a length of rope and careful eyes. The family graves sit exactly where they have always sat, undisturbed, the small shrine beside them freshly swept, fresh incense burning in the cracked clay holder my husband placed there decades ago. I did not become wealthy from any of this. I want to be clear about that. For anyone who might imagine this story ends with some great fortune, restored to an old woman who deserved it, the land was never meant to make anyone rich. It was meant only to hold what could not be measured in money, memory, continuity, the quiet promise that some things in a family are not for sale, no matter how desperate the debts, or how convincing the smile across the dinner table. The legal proceedings concluded, some months later. Yen Vai faced formal charges for financial fraud and forgery, the weight of the evidence leaving little room for the kind of soft persuasion she had once used so effectively on people inclined to trust her. Kai's situation resolved differently, his cooperation with the investigation, his eventual full account of what he had known and when, spared him the harsher consequences his wife faced alone. But something between us had been altered in a way no court ruling could repair or restore. He moved out of the house that autumn, taking only what was rightfully his, leaving behind the room he had grown up in, now quiet, now empty in a way that still catches me sometimes in the late afternoon light. He visits now, every few weeks, always alone, always a little uncertain at the gate, as though some part of him still expects to be turned away. I have never turned him away. I light incense beside him at his father's altar each time he comes, and we stand together in silence, the same silence I once offered Yen Vai, across this very room, though what passes between my son and me now carries something gentler in it. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the slow, patient beginning of something that might, with enough careful tending, grow back toward it. I had Ko Lian help me file new paperwork that winter, formalizing what I had always intended for the land long before any of this began. Not a sale, not a transfer dressed up as protection, a proper, careful allocation, the kind my father-in-law would have recognized and approved of, the parcel preserved permanently for the family's remembrance, with clear provisions ensuring it could never again be quietly listed behind anyone's back, never again reduced to a line item in someone else's desperate arithmetic. I named my granddaughter, Kai's daughter from his first marriage, now 19 and studying agriculture at the provincial university, as the eventual steward of the land's care, not its owner to sell, but its keeper, the way I had once been its keeper, the way my husband's mother had been before me. She came to visit last month. This granddaughter I had not seen nearly enough of during the difficult years that came before. She walked the boundary of the land with me slowly, asking careful questions about the old banyan tree, about her great-grandfather's handwriting on the original document. I finally showed her about what it meant to hold something, not for what it could be sold for, but for what it remembered. "Grandmother," she asked me, standing beside the family graves as the late afternoon light turned everything gold, "weren't you afraid? Standing alone against both of them, with nothing but old paperwork?" I thought about the question for a long moment, watching the wind move gently through the bamboo grove at the grove's edge, that same dry, patient rustling I had listened to so many evenings during the hardest months of all this. "Still water runs the deepest," I told her, the way my own mother once told me, the way I have carried those words quietly through every season of my life since. I was never empty, even when I appeared calm. I was simply gathering everything I needed beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would matter most. She smiled at that, the way young people smile at old sayings they are only beginning to understand the weight of, and we walked the rest of the boundary together in comfortable silence, the incense smoke from the shrine, trailing thin and gray into the soft evening air behind us. That evening, alone again in the house my husband built, I lit the last incense stick of the day at his altar and looked for a long while at his photograph, steady and familiar in the candlelight, the way it has looked back at me every evening for 5 years now. They thought silence meant I had nothing left to say. They were wrong about that, the same way they were wrong about so much else. Silence was never my absence of an answer. It was simply where I kept it, until the day it was needed. Still water runs the deepest, I told myself again. Settling into the quiet of the house, the incense smoke curling slowly upward into the dark, and the deepest water, when it finally moves everything in its path. If you're an older parent who's ever been spoken over at your own dinner table, if you've ever been called forgetful for remembering things a little too clearly, this story is for you. You are not a burden waiting to be managed. You are the keeper of everything that matters most, and that kind of quiet strength never expires with age. If this story moved you, give it a like, and subscribe for more stories about the quiet strength of those who came before us. It really does help this channel keep going. If you were in Grandma Han's shoes, would you have confronted them the moment you found out? Or waited and gathered your evidence in silence like she did? Let me know in the comments below.